Good morning, everybody. It's lesson 11, Advanced Server-Side Scripting. Today's lesson is asynchronous, so you don't need to follow along in real time, although you certainly can. All I would ask is if you are watching this video not live on Tuesday morning, that you go through the exercise files, the things that I'm doing online today. I will post them to GitHub. Do them before next week's class, because we're going to do some more advanced stuff with Angular next week. If you are on the live stream, maybe on YouTube, if you want to just put in a quick comment and say hi so I know who's here. And if the YouTube comments don't seem to be working out well for questions, then I can also open a WebEx meeting so that you can turn on your mic and say, hey, Rich, hang on, I have a question. Morning, Blair. So I'm going to go over a few things today. And as I said, if it would be helpful for me to have a WebEx live meeting so we could actually chat in real-time audio, I can certainly do that. Morning, Andy. So I did send out an announcement, but I'm just going to kind of go over the things that are here. So there is a review quiz. So there's a bunch of things due today. So if you go into the Lesson 11 lesson, your quiz is open now. I'm just going to make sure there's no password on it. So you're free to do the quiz at home. There is no password. You have until midnight tonight. So it's a review, some multiple choice, true, false, and short answer of our previous 3 lessons. Obviously, we didn't have a lesson last week. So you have until midnight to do that quiz. Okay, so that's the first item. The second item, actually, I'll just go back. I'm going to be posting Lab 3 later today. So the idea with Lab 3, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of the project plans that were submitted for Assignment 2, Part 1, and I'm going to distribute those out so everybody's going to get someone else's project plan. And all I'm asking you to do for the lab is to provide them with some feedback. So what do you like about their project plan, and do you have any suggestions or constructive feedback? So then you will be posting for Lab 3. Excuse me. I think what I'll do is maybe set up an online folder that everybody can access. Maybe I'll set up a OneDrive folder or a Google Drive folder, and I'll just have you upload your comments, as well as you can also email them to your classmates. So basically, easy marks, the lab, it's not so much a qualitative grade. It's either you did it and you get full marks, or you didn't do it and you don't get any marks. So I will set that up, and you'll have until 5 o'clock on Thursday to provide some feedback to a classmate. It's also going to give you some feedback from somebody else in the class. Excuse me. And I am available most of the day, so we happy to have a WebEx meeting if you've got questions, if you need any help with today's lesson, or anything else you might want to chat about. Send me a meeting request through Outlook. That'll directly email it to me so I know what time you want to talk, and it will put it in my Outlook calendar. If for some reason that time's not available, I'll just suggest another time, but my plan is to be available most of the afternoon. I'm going to be doing some marking and meeting with any students who need a meeting. So I am regularly just going to have to jump back over to Chrome just to make sure, just to check if there are any comments or questions coming in that I can pause to try and address those. The other thing I wanted to just look at is I've set up the schedule, just sort of randomly drew an order for our tutorials in weeks 13 and 14. Now, we actually do have 7 groups. So I've added both in our presentation sign-up sheet, I have added numbers. So those numbers indicate the order, and also in the actual list of groups, your groups will now have a number in front of them. So those numbers indicate the presentation order. Now, because we have 7 groups, I didn't really want to shorten the tutorial times, because I think if I shorten them anymore, it's just not going to be enough time for you to really be able to deliver much. So we're going to have the first 4 tutorials in week 13. So yes, I'm asking you to stick around a little longer. That'll be a WebEx class. So that day we'll have each presentation. Now, some of them may be less than 50 minutes, but we'll have a 10-minute break between each tutorial. So our class will start at 9 a.m. On the Tuesday in 2 weeks, and we'll have the first 4 teams present and teach us about real-time chat, React, Stripe payments, and API authentication. And then in our final class in week 14, we'll have our last 3 tutorials. So the expectation is that those 2 classes will be synchronous, that we'll have a WebEx meeting. It'll just be the standard WebEx My Meeting Room. And the group that is running the tutorial can just share their screen and talk through the tutorial, much like we did for our Project Studio team meetings yesterday. So that's our plan. The team meetings seem to go fairly well. So I think we'll manage. I realize I'm asking you to spend an extra hour of time in class on in week 13 as we do 4 tutorials. So all the groups should have access to the tutorial instructions now on Blackboard. So again, in assignments, I've renamed the item from presentation. It's not so much of a presentation, so I've renamed it to group tutorials. So your instructions are here. And I think before the break, I explained, I'll also maybe open up this document, that the other thing I want you to do is before the day of your tutorial, as a group, you're going to need to decide the weighting for each member of the team. So if every member made an equal and full contribution, you would give each team member 100%, but you have to submit this together as a team. It's not an individual, so you'll have to have some remote conversation and weigh up and assess fairly how much did each member contribute. And then that percentage is what you get, the percentage of your overall grade as explained in this example. So if there's any confusion or any questions around that, then please email me or book an appointment and we can chat about that if those instructions aren't clear. Okay, so some teams have 2 weeks to prepare and other teams have 3 weeks to prepare. I will keep that in mind as well when I'm evaluating them, that some teams have had a little more time. Okay, so let's jump into Angular. Excuse me. So we're going to run through just a short slide deck by way of introduction. You can find those slides in the Lesson 11 folder. This Lesson 11 Slides Angular is the item we're looking at. So what is it? Angular, it's designed for creating dynamic UIs. We very commonly see it in SPAs or single page applications. So this would be where the application is fairly simple. So something like, let's say, an ordering screen on a website like Skip the Dishes. There's not a lot of complex functionality. And what Angular allows is it allows our data to be updated in real time where users don't have to reload or refresh a page. So really common for e-commerce. So again, I'll stick with my, an online food ordering system like a Skip the Dishes or a Foodora. As I'm putting items into my cart, I may have an Angular interface where maybe it has my cart total on the side of the page and it's automatically updating every time I put an item in my cart or update the quantity, that my page doesn't need to be reloaded for me to see that happening in real time. Angular does allow us to write both web and native mobile apps with a single code base. So we can build a web application with an Angular UI, and then we can recompile that UI to run natively on iOS devices or on Android devices. One of the other things about Angular, and this makes it a little bit different from some of the competing front-end frameworks, which I'll talk a bit more about, is that it's opinionated. That Angular is big. It's not just a library like something like React or Vue, but it's a framework, which means, and when we say it's opinionated, Angular has a really kind of strong set of guidelines as to how your application has to be organized and your code needs to be written. This would be in contrast to something like React. React isn't considered a full front-end JavaScript framework. It's considered a library. that was created by Facebook originally for internal use. And with React, developers have a lot more freedom in terms of how they want to implement a React UI. And one application to another, the code structure is going to look really different. Angular is much more rigid and much more structured. The benefit of that, however, is there's a lot of things that are automated, and developers have to make a lot less decisions about how to structure their Angular applications. So Angular was also really kind of the granddaddy. It was the first of these big UI front-end frameworks. Many people are suggesting now it's been usurped or overtaken by React or Vue, which I know a lot of you used with Albert last semester. So how does it kind of play with the other technologies that we've been working with? Again, just jump in here for any questions. I don't see any yet. So we could build, we've been building apps with our Node and Mongo Express stack right now with just the men stack, and we can build full-scale applications. So where Angular is going to fit in is we're really going to be replacing our front-end HTML template engine. So we've been using Handlebars, our HBS files this semester. Other times in this course, we've used templating engines like Pug or EJS. So Angular sort of sits here, that it sits in between our client device and our Node server that handles requests. One thing you'll note is we're going to have to write a lot more code in order to replace our HBS templates with Angular. The result is we're going to get a much richer user experience, but we are going to have to write a lot more code. Really, with our current setup, our UI layer, our view layer, it's really only one layer, which is our set of HBS files. We're going to be replacing our HBS files with really 3 different layers. So this one layer is going to become 3 more. Our front-end UI is actually just going to be plain old HTML with Angular code injected inside of it. So we're going to go back to having HTML extensions on our pages, and then we're going to inject 2 other Angular layers in between. We're going to have a component layer that basically handles all the logic of our Angular application. And then we also have a service layer, that's sort of our API, and that's kind of our bridge between Angular and our Node server. So for example, if we have a method to display data, we're going to need the display in the HTML page, we're going to need a component to send that data to the UI, and we're going to need an Angular service or API that will be the interface to our server backend. So we are going to have a fair bit more code once we implement this, but the idea is, again, we're providing a better user experience. An important thing to note with Angular, the original version was called AngularJS, and this was version 1. So if you're looking for resources about Angular and you see anything titled AngularJS, it's version 1, and we don't want to use it. Version 1 to version 2 were completely different. There was really, the advice was at the time, well, I have a version 1 AngularJS app, and now that version 2 is up, I want to convert it. Typo in my slide. So how do I best convert it? And the short answer was you don't convert it. You actually have to rewrite it because the differences between from 1 to 2 were so great. So anything you see that just says Angular, that's version 2 and higher. And versions 2 and higher, those are interoperable between different versions, but not for version 1. So again, if you're looking for a tutorial, a video, if it says AngularJS, you probably don't want to use it because that code is basically deprecated and obsolete and isn't going to work with any modern Angular code. So what Angular offers, and where it really kind of became so popular, is it offers this 2-way data binding. So what this means is when we build a page with Angular, and we tie that page to, let's say, a table in or a collection in our database, if we're using a NoSQL database, the UI, the view, is always checking if the data that's being displayed matches the underlying data model. And if it doesn't, then Angular automatically will update the UI with any changes in the data. So normally we could only do this with HTTP by actually refreshing a page. That was the only way to make that page show current data. And Angular was sort of the first really popular technology that allowed us to, in real time, show data updates. So I guess it wasn't, we did have Ajax before it, but Angular was a big improvement. So here's another picture at what this looks like. So underneath in the back end, we might have our Angular, our components for our logic and our service. That's our API layer. And then we've got our HTML templates that are constantly communicating with our Angular components, which are communicating with our services in the back end. And it's checking to make sure that the UI is always showing current data. So one of the things we'll do, we'll kind of get to it next week, is we're going to want to build, in our Node app, we've built out right now our global food. We sort of have two pages. We have one page where we have a list of food, and then we have a separate page where a form where we would go where we would add a food and come back and then see that new food. With Angular, we can actually do this all on one page. We could have a form to add a new food. We could have a list on the same page. And as soon as we save a new document to MongoDB, we want our list to be updated without our page having to do a full reload. So that's kind of where we're going with this and how we'll integrate it in with the rest of our Node and Express and MongoDB app for next week. This week, we're only going to play with Angular. We're going to separate it out from the rest of the stack and just play with Angular on its own. And we'll next week look at integrating it with the rest of the stack. One of the other important features of Angular, and this is going to be something new, is how we actually write the code. So while Angular does run on JavaScript, we don't actually write plain ES6 or ES7 as we've been doing with Node. So Angular actually uses a version, a superset of JavaScript. It's known as Typescript, which was created by Microsoft. So the idea of Typescript is, because JavaScript is loosely typed or untyped, Microsoft created Typescript, which is a way to allow us to write strongly typed JavaScript. It also allows, Typescript also supports objects, so we can have full object-oriented principles when we're working with TypeScript. So what happens is we write our code in TypeScript, and then it gets transpiled, which means it gets converted into plain JavaScript. So the files we write, we're going to create our Angular files. They're going to have .ts extensions. We write them in TypeScript, but the Angular transpiler will convert those into JS files. So if we make a TS file called foods.ts, Angular will generate a matching file called foods.js. So it'll be a little bit, and one of the other great benefits of this is because JavaScript is generally not compiled when we're writing apps with JavaScript. Typically, things don't fail. There's no compile before we run them. So oftentimes we don't find out that we have errors until we look at things in the browser. TypeScript will catch your errors when you're coding or at compile time. So that's going to reduce errors. Andy, I did see your email. I will have a look at it a bit later and get back to you. Thank you. So we're going to write our main logic in TypeScript. Angular will structure the project, but really we're going to be using TypeScript to actually write our Angular code. I'm just going to take a quick jump over to this tutorial. I'm not going to walk through the whole thing, but I want to sort of show you what is TypeScript actually, what does it look like? So this link I've also put up here on Blackboard. This is from the official TypeScript site, typescriptlang.org. And we'll have a quick look just to give you a sense of what does TypeScript look like. So there are plugins for it in Visual Studio, although we're not working in Visual Studio, or there's an NPM package. So we're going to need this. This is one of the packages we're going to need to install today. So we're going to install TypeScript, and we're going to install it globally. So here's a really simple TypeScript file. So we can create a function, and so this looks pretty much like regular JavaScript, but notice it does have a .ts extension. So even though this is plain JavaScript, we could then run the file with the TypeScript compiler, which is TSC. But we can start to look at, so for example, here's where we see some of the differences between TypeScript and JavaScript. In JavaScript, right, plain JavaScript, we would just pass in a person variable. It's untyped. There's no data type of that parameter. Whereas in TypeScript, we would actually declare a type. That person is a string. So if we were, for example, to pass in a numeric parameter here, TypeScript is going to complain and say, nope, this has to be a string. We won't really worry about interfaces. TypeScript also has full support for classes, just like traditional object-oriented languages that we've worked with, like C#. Okay, so we could create a class with a bunch of properties. Those properties are strongly typed. They're not loosely typed like in JavaScript. And we could create constructor methods with parameters that are strongly typed. So we'll be using TypeScript to write all of our Angular code, and there is support for TypeScript both in WebStorm as well as in PHP Storm. So as I mentioned, these slides are here for you as a reference, and the link to TypeScript. This 5-minute document is here. A couple other resources I've put up here. I'm not going to show you these because these are videos. So well, actually, this one you could go through. This is a quick Angular tutorial. So some of the basics, it's sort of a simple hello world, and then how to do some basic math, etc. This one is a little bit older because notice it says Angular JS. So this is actually going to give you maybe I should turn this one off because this one is a bit old. Yeah, I think I'll hide that one. We probably don't need it. But also here is this one's a quick video. I'm not going to stream a YouTube video in another YouTube video, but it's a pretty good and simple description of how TypeScript works. Now we only have a couple lessons. I mean, Angular and TypeScript are fairly broad. The other resource I will point you to is LinkedIn Learning. So you have access to LinkedIn Learning. If you actually go to lynda.com and then we sign in with our Georgian account, don't sign in with your LinkedIn account because it will want you to pay. If you sign in with your organization, it asks for Georgian as the domain. And there's a lot of really good resources here. In particular, this one. So there's a bunch of good Angular courses on here. So these are free to you as Georgian students. So this is really Angular right from the beginning. So they walk through all the pieces, how the data binding works with Angular. This course is up to date. I think it's about a year old now, but it's not version 1, how to do forms and services. There are a number of other Angular trainings here. So 48 different courses on Angular. So there's lots here. Even how to build Angular front ends with ASP.NET Core backends, which you guys already know how to do. And this one's fairly up to date, only 3 months old. It's a 3-hour course. Here's another great one from last year. Angular front end, ASP.NET Core backend, and Entity Framework. So there's some good resources here that I will point you to. There's another, this one's older, mean stack, but it is 4 years old. So probably some of this stuff is pretty out of date. But if you want to, we'll do some of the basics today. But there are some other resources here if you want to learn more about Angular. Okay, so what we want to do is actually get Angular and TypeScript set up and installed on our machines. Okay. So first thing I'm going to do is open up my command prompt. And I'm going to go into my node directory. So what I want to do is, well, actually, I want to do a couple things. We need to install a few things, and then we're going to use Angular to actually make a new folder for today. So I'm not going to work in my global food project. Here's my global food. I'm going to create a new folder for today and build a new Angular app inside of it. So first thing I'm going to do is I need to install TypeScript, and I need to install it globally. So I'm going to run the command npm I -g TypeScript. I'll leave that up for a minute so you can go ahead and run that at your command prompt. Doesn't really matter where you are. It's your command prompt in order to run this command. So npm I -g TypeScript. So this will let me install TypeScript globally. Now it's also saying there's actually an update to npm. So do you want to update your npm? And it's saying run npm install or I -g npm. I'm going to do that as well. npm I -g npm. So this is actually updating the package manager itself. Actually, I don't know if any of you saw, some news came out just this week as well that npm has actually been purchased by GitHub, which was purchased by Microsoft. So that's all actually now going to be under the Microsoft umbrella. I don't think we'll see major changes to npm, just as there hasn't really been major changes to GitHub. But some of you may have seen that in the news just within recent days. So I'm going to update my npm as well. Okay, so npm's been updated for me. So we're installing TypeScript globally and npm globally to do an update. Again, the npm update, not important, not critical. It says it's a minor version. I went from 6.10.3 to 6.14.3. So what we want to do next, I'll actually add the link to, we want to jump over here. I'll put this link up on Blackboard. I had meant to. And this is the main Angular site. So it's angular.io. The original Angular 1 site, which I think is still up, is angularjs.com. So if you get AngularJS, again, that's version 1, which is pretty out of date. Let me just put up the web link. So I'll throw up the link here in the lesson 11 folder. So we can poke around in here, and there's a few instructions in here we're going to want to use. So if I go to the docs link, there's lots of resources here. There's actually an excellent tutorial in here. And if I click on the Get Started and your first app, Now there's a few options. This one is, I don't want to do that. Just bear with me. There is a quick start. I think we want to go into the setup for a moment. So under setup, yeah, so this is what we need. So I'm under, you can see the URL, or if once, so again, I'll just go right back to the home page so you can see what I got here. So from the main page, if you go to Docs and click on Setup, we want to go in here. Okay. So it tells us, what do we need? We need Node. Well, we know that we have Node running. We need NPM. We know we have NPM. And we will need TypeScript, which we just installed. So the next thing we want to install is this package, which is the Angular, the CLI, the command line interface. So this will allow us to run Angular commands in our Windows command prompt or our Mac terminal. So I'm going to run this command you see here. So we've got the npm install -g at angular.cli. I'll actually put that command on Blackboard as well. So here's our global install command. And I'll also put the link to the setup. So I've added to the Angular homepage item the link directly to the setup. And then there's the command you can run install, or again, you can just run I. And we want to install this globally. Okay, so those items are here for you. So I'm going to go ahead and run that command now. npm, I'll just use I -g, and the package I want is at Angular /CLI. So we can never have spaces in the names. And most of the Angular packages start with that @ symbol. So go ahead and run that command. No, Blair. You don't need to remove older Angular versions. Okay. Especially if you have the Angular CLI, this will just update it, just like I did with NPM. If it's already installed, it will just do an in-place over install over top. So you shouldn't have any problem. Okay, so I'm going to install the CLI. Yes, thanks, Envy. Yeah, so if you run the command, it will just install the newer version. Thank you. So it takes a minute, and now I'm done. So in a minute, I'll go back over to the Angular page and I'll follow the instructions to create a new Angular app. Now notice also the path I'm in. I'm in my Node folder here. So this is where I've been creating all of my Node projects, including my global food. So I'm in the same folder here in Windows. So here's my global food. So I want to use the Angular CLI tool now to create a new Angular app. And like the Express generator also builds a folder, the Angular CLI will build a new folder. So I want that new folder to be created here. So I'm going to make sure in my command prompt, I'm inside of my Node directory. So if we just have a look at what the setup says, is once you've installed it, to create a new workspace and install a starter app. So again, this is kind of like the Angular version of the Express generator. It creates an application, scaffolds an application shell for us that we can actually run immediately. And now that we've installed the command line interface, these commands will start with ng. So those are Angular commands. So the code here says ng new, and then it's got a name with no spaces, name of an application. So I'm going to run a similar command. I'm going to run ng new, but I don't want to call it my app. I'm going to run the command ng new, and I'll call it, let's see, winter W20 lesson 11. So I'm going to make an Angular app for today, and I'm going to make a separate one for next week. So again, today we're only working with Angular. Next week, we're going to build an Express app and then put an Angular app inside of it. So you can call your folder for today anything you like. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to call mine again. So I'm going to use ng space new space W20 lesson 11. So what that's going to do is create a new folder inside my node, my existing node directory. It's going to create a winter 20 lesson 11 directory, and Angular will scaffold out an application that we'll be able to run in just a minute. So I'm going to run that command and let the Angular CLI scaffold out. And it says, do we want to use Angular routing? I'll just say yes. What CSS do I want? I'm just going to hit enter, which is, it defaults to, you can see in blue in my command window, just defaults to plain CSS. I don't need SCSS, Sass, less, or stylus. So I'll just hit enter. And the CLI is going to go ahead, it's going to create that folder and create a bunch of files inside, a bunch of JSON configuration files. And then we're also going to get some JavaScript as well as some TS files, some TypeScript files. It's going to create a default style sheet, favicon, index.html. And you can see all the TypeScript files it's creating. So this takes a little longer than the Express generator does. So we'll just give it a minute to finish. Just give it a minute to finish doing its thing. Actually, while it's installing, I'll go back to the Angular page for just a second. So it says after it's done, it tells us that it might take, the documents say it may take a few minutes, creates a workspace and a simple app that's ready to run. It includes a server so we can run our app locally. So all we need to do is now go into the new folder with CD, and to start the server and also open it in the browser, we will run the command ng serve -- open. This will start our Angular server, compile our app, and it will automatically open a browser tab to localhost 4200 is the default port. And this is actually what the template app is going to look like. So it's a little more robust than what we get with the Express generator. There's more content on the main page, more styling. So this is what our app should look like when it's finished running. My command prompt acting a little bit strange here. I can't quite tell if this is done. Okay. I think it's done because my command prompt is back. So now I'm going to try this. I'm going to do CD into my new folder. I'm going to sort of follow the instructions here. I may have to delete my app and try it again, but hopefully not. So I've entered my new folder, which is down here. So here's what our Angular app looks like. So I can either start the server from here, or I could open up WebStorm, which I'm going to do anyway. But for now, I'll just run the command ngserve ---- open. So this is going to compile all the TypeScript code to JavaScript, start the Angular server, and open a browser tab to localhost 4200. So the compiling of our Angular app, it takes a little bit longer. Blair, do you want to email me a screenshot? So the compilation takes a little while. It's not as fast as, say, Express, because all of that TypeScript code has to get transpiled to JavaScript. It takes a minute and opens up the page. It puts in the folder name as the title, writes the application name here, and then gives us a whole bunch of sort of boilerplate content here, including some links. So my app is up and running. So I'm going to open up WebStorm now and open up this project. We'll just poke around with it and make a few minor changes, and then we'll take a break. We'll do some more with it after our break. So I'm going to go into my node folder and open up my project. Okay, so it automatically gives us a README file, tells us the instructions of how to run it. And if we want to create components, which we could do today, or we have one component that's already here, we'll run this ng component, we'll generate component. We'll certainly do that next week. Ng build will compile. It has the ability to run unit testing. We probably won't have time to get to that. It uses an NPM package called Karma, popular JavaScript package, as well as other instructions, or you could use ng help to get help with the README. Okay, that's interesting. I'm just looking. Now, Blair, do you see? So it says that these files already have been created. So I think, I'm not sure exactly why you got the error, but it looks like the project has been created successfully. So maybe just have a look in your file system, open up your folder, and just see if your folder list looks something like mine. If it does, then I would try to enter the directory with cd and then run the ngserve -- open commands that you see here on the Angular page. So cd, folder name, and then try ngserve and open. So try that and see if it runs. I think it might. Okay, so I think it worked the first time if it's saying those folders were there. Got it. Okay, so do the cd, run the cd command and the ngserve -- open and see if the project opens and runs for you. So I'm just going to, we'll take a quick tour of what's actually in here before we have a break. Okay. So we get a package.json, just like we had. So it shows us the commands for compiling, running unit tests, starting the server. We can see the dependencies. So it has a whole bunch of dependencies. And then so some that are sort of all dependencies and some that are only for development. So it has, for example, so things like Jasmine and Karma for unit testing. Angular also does, it will do a built-in refresh, kind of like NodeMon, how we installed. If we make changes, the Angular compiler at development time, it will automatically recompile our site, which is useful. No problem at all. That's fine. Yeah, you can just create another project with a different name if you like, and it'll create a new folder. So a bunch of these are configuration files. So here's our TypeScript configuration. So it compiles to ES 2015. And most of our actual application code lives here. It lives inside the source directory. So here's what we've got. We have a home page, and if you look, it's quite interesting at how Angular works. So here's all the HTML on our page. It has an HTML extension. It's got a favorite icon, but in the body, all we see is this Angular tag, this app root. So we can define our own tags in Angular. So this represents a component in the application. When I go and view the source of the page, you'll notice all we see is the app root. We don't actually see all the other HTML code that shows up in our page. So Angular kind of hides a lot of that because this app root is replaced at runtime with dynamic HTML and JavaScript. But the users don't actually see this in the browser. So what is this app root tag and where does it live? Inside of our source, we have an app section, and in here you'll notice there's a whole bunch of files. So this is key. We've got app root here. So we've got several things. We have a style sheet, an HTML document, a couple of TypeScript documents, 3 TypeScript documents. So here's what we see. Let's look at the HTML first. So the HTML, it says this is a placeholder and can be replaced. So it has a whole bunch of CSS that's injected directly into the HTML. We probably will want to move it out of there. So the CSS section's quite long. And then the actual content is here, where we've got our toolbar and all of the content is here. And you'll notice here, this is going to look familiar. We see handlebar style syntax. So this is one of the reasons that I've chosen to use handlebars templating for the first part of the course, because we're now used to these handlebars or mustache tags to represent server-side values. So when we move to Angular, Angular uses that same syntax. So this represents a variable that's coming from the back end. Okay, so there's all of our content. We're going to remove a lot of this stuff and replace it with some of our own. We also see some other Angular code here. So we have a switch case. So we can basically say, if this, show this. So this is showing basically, actually, let's see what this looks like in the browser. So if I click that button, it then toggles what's down below in here. So this is set, each one of these sets a variable. So we've got some logic here with this star ng switch. So we'll, like I said, we'll get rid of most of that. So where does the, it has its own, every page gets its own CSS file if we want, automatically has the same name. And a lot of the logic happens here. So we saw on index.html, we saw this app root tag. So how does Angular know what that tag is? This is a self-defined tag. And in the component, it said, here's the selector. So this component is represented or is rendered inside of this HTML tag. And in here, it says our content lives in this HTML file. And if we have its own style sheet, it's here. And then we've got a title variable. And that's what's represented in our handlebars tag here. So here's my title. So I'm just going to show you something about how this works. So we can see our title in my browser tab. My app is called W20 Lesson 11. Let's try and make this a little fuller. Now notice, if I go to my component, here's how Angular's two-way data binding works. I'm just going to try to shrink this down a bit. We're almost due for a break. I want to try and show what happens when I make a code change in my browser. Okay, so I can see the code. So in my app.component.ts, it's got our title here as W20 Lesson 11. That's what shows up here. If I change this, say Lesson 11, first Angular app, and I hit Control S to save, notice what happens. Angular automatically reloads and updates. Now with NodeMon would restart the server, but we would still have to manually hit refresh in the browser to see any changes, not with Angular. So if I go back to my terminal, it automatically recompiled. It said there were 5 changed chunks, and it recompiled. Not only did it recompile, but it automatically refreshed. So this is something the Angular compiler does that's new, that we haven't seen. And so any changes I make in my backend, I change something in my component, change my variable, that will automatically update and restarts the server with that change, and that variable gets updated in almost real time. Okay, it's 9:55, so I'm going to take about a 10-minute break here. I will stop this stream, okay, and add it to our playlist. I'm not going to push the code yet, because really all I did was scaffold the application, and I just changed that one title variable. So I don't think there's any reason to push to Git yet. So what we'll do when we come back is we want to make more changes to the scaffolded application. We want to get rid of most of this content and start to replace it with our own content. So we'll look at that in about 10 minutes. Good question, Blair. The title in the tab is in a separate area. We'll change that when we come back. We'll change it when we come back, and it will also update automatically. Good question. So we'll do that first as soon as we come back. I'm just going to take a quick pause here.